I have covered a lot of phones that people consider the best of all time, but I've arguably left the ultimate device till last. This one I was incredibly excited to take a look at. I bided my time before spending out on a sample from eBay. So today, let's talk about a proper GOAT contender. It's got it all: a gorgeous chassis, beautiful screen, a headphone port, micro SD card slot. This is of course the Samsung Galaxy S10. This is one of the most legendary smartphones in my opinion. It had a fantastic balance of features, quality and slick design, something I look for in every tech product, and thankfully the new Opera One R2 browser is the perfect example of this, headlined by its main feature being the built-in Aria AI tool. It's easy to access. You bring it up with a quick command. It loads on top of your current tab so that you don't have to leave what you're doing. So let's find out what are the specs. Galaxy S25 Ultra. And there you go, it's loading up the specs now. We can click across to use page context, to use what actually is in your tab as part of your question to find out the answer. It can also draw AI imagery based on prompts as well. So let's do draw me a racing car. And there you go, kind of looks like a McLaren. It can also do split screen multitasking. So say here I have a camera that I'm looking at and I want to look at what Reddit says about it. I can drag that tab down and have split screen where I'm able to resize it with inside the browser. You can group tabs together and collapse or expand them using what Opera is calling tab islands. If you're like me and you have loads of tabs open at any one time, it's just a really useful tool to have. And if you're looking for your most recently used tabs, there are tab traces, these little lines underneath the tabs. The darker the underline, the more recently you've had that tab open. Useful for keeping track of things. I really like this floating music player. You can load up, say, Spotify, and I can drag it inside but also outside of the browser window, which is great. The floating player works with 6 different streaming services, so you should be able to get what you want logged in on this feature. The dynamic themes and customization here are just sick as well. I like the Aurora theme, so I can click into it, I can then customize it and fine tune it just how I want it with a bit of pink in there. The Opera One R2 browser is genuinely the most feature-rich browser I've ever used. So check the pinned comment or the description for more details, and a massive thank you to Opera for sponsoring today's content. I covered the S10e not long ago, and I still believe that to be perhaps the perfect phone in terms of its form factor and chassis, and its otherwise main difference to this being the side-mounted capacitive fingerprint reader, beautiful colours and some relatively flat display glass, which some clearly prefer. Interestingly, BGR.com reported that the Galaxy S10 Plus, this device's bigger sibling, was actually the best-selling model of the three, which I guess kind of makes sense given we're constantly told that people want big phones, and that was a good amount larger than this thing. But I've always had a soft spot for the Galaxy S10, and that says a lot because not long after this thing came out, Huawei launched the P30 Pro, and then 2 months after that, OnePlus launched the 7 Pro. My word, what a year 2019 was for smartphones. I mean, it was just banger after banger after banger. And the Galaxy S10 was reviewed pretty well from all different outlets. It was loved for its fantastic battery life and performance, truly elite display, versatile camera stack with the 3 different focal lengths on the back of it, and of course it still came with the headphone port and micro SD card slot, where some other manufacturers were starting to phase those features out. The real problem that the S10 had was that the S10e and S10 Plus were generally regarded as the more favourable options due to their unique perks that didn't come with the base model S10. But I think for that reason, this phone is incredibly slept on. It was and still is, over 6 years later, an absolute masterpiece in my opinion. The horizontal camera array on the back, this white glass colour, the gorgeous curved glass into the super thin rails, the perfectly positioned buttons with the headphone port on the bottom next to the USB-C, the corner situated punch hole, the impossibly thin bezels for the time. It's considerably less bulky than even the P30 Pro, as much as I absolutely adore that phone. And here it is compared to a normal Galaxy S24, a phone that came out about half a decade later. I don't know about you, but I truly believe that this just looks and feels leagues ahead of the phones we have these days. It's so slick. It's actually incredibly refreshing to hold in 2025 next to the bulky and cumbersome squared off sides that we have these days, even in the smaller devices. I bought this example from eBay for just over £100, which is, for an older model, quite expensive-ish if you ask me, and I probably wouldn't have bought it had I not intended to make this video with it. The previous owner seems to have kept it in remarkable condition considering its age, They even included the old people case, which is very nice. One place where this phone was heavily contested back in 2019 was its camera array. This was the first Galaxy S to come with the Holy Trinity, the main, the ultrawide and the telephoto on the back, making up this wonderful camera visor, but none of the sensors and lenses were particularly groundbreaking when the S10 launched, let alone after half a decade down the road. But honestly, I was pleasantly surprised at just how well these things performed in 2025. Sure, you aren't getting the same crazy dynamic range or shallow depth of field that you'll get with modern, latest flagship sensors, even the sensors found in mid-ranges like the Pixel 8a and OnePlus 13R. Those sensors are comparatively huge compared to this thing, but Samsung's processing is still pretty decent, and in good light, these are still shockingly usable stills. As much as we've seen great leaps in the fine details of our camera systems over the past 5 years, functionally, they're not all that different. Our innovation has certainly slowed right down, which is kind of sad to think about, but at the same time it means that phones like this are still very usable from a camera perspective in 2025. That main sensor is about the same size as the one out of the Pixel at the time, and the S10's main camera even came with a variable aperture that could go from f1.5 to f2.4, which, though a little bit gimmicky, is pretty cool for the time, and it could even shoot Ultra HD 4K at 30 and 60 FPS, along with a slew of different slow-mo modes, which made for an, at the time, pretty comprehensive camera experience, and it still holds up really well all these years later. Because I'm sure many of you already know by now, the Galaxy S10 software has been long out of date by this point. My unit is running One UI 4.1 based on Android 12, which is 3 whole Android versions newer than what the phone came with. For 2019, that is pretty impressive. There are the obvious potential security and compatibility problems that come with using a phone this old, which is a real shame, because honestly, the S10 just feels so nice to use in 2025. And One UI combined with this hardware just goes so hard from an aesthetic point of view, if you ask me. You can still play games with relative ease, although I must say Genshin and COD mobile enjoyers need not apply. This is not one of those phones. It's still remarkably nice to use, even though my model is the lesser Exynos 9820 option instead of the superior Snapdragon 855 model that like the US and China got. That's something as well I just don't miss these days, having to worry about which SKU you're getting, because you're getting meaningfully different hardware internally. That's not something we really have to worry about these days. I'm sure most of you won't remember this, but I was actually gifted a red Galaxy S10 by Android Authority back in the day when I left, which was amazing. That red colour I had was absolutely stunning, and it was my personal phone for quite a good while actually. I used it quite a lot after I sold what I believe was my iPhone 11 if memory serves, and that's where I found out how cool this phone really was and why I still have a soft spot for it years later. I totally understand that to be able to have the larger camera sensors and lens structures, larger batteries, and more powerful chips, we need to have larger phones, particularly in the Z-axis or the thickness. And I know that for most enthusiasts, they seem to want flat sides these days and a flat screen. And for those people, modern smartphones are absolutely wonderful. But for me, this design style is just so much nicer. My favourite modern phone to hold these days probably is the OnePlus 12, thanks to it having those curved sides, but it is still too big. The Galaxy S10 is so refreshingly manageable, not only in the hand, but in the pocket as well. It's a wonderful setup. I would spend big money to have something like this with an up-to-date chip, silicon carbon battery, and even just a little bit better camera. I know people who still, like the P30 Pro, are holding on to their Galaxy S10s because of its headphone port, its microSD card slot, and the fact that it's still absolutely usable and enjoyable to use in 2025, even if its battery has significantly degraded by this point and the software is a few versions out of date. This is one of those devices that proves to you that newer isn't always better, and that if you don't have a nagging need to upgrade, maybe you just shouldn't. It's pretty wasteful to buy the latest thing every year or two, but hey, I'm not going to stand in your way. Enjoy life and enjoy technology. The Galaxy S10 is a mascot of potentially the single best year in mobile tech history, and it somehow still manages to impress despite its astute contemporaries. It's a truly wonderful phone that I wish someone would really copy the design of in 2025, if only for that form factor. This is going to go down for me as one of the best phones of all time. because it balances so many of the best features and qualities and then packs them into a wonderful form factor. What a brilliant trip down memory lane this was, as bittersweet as it is.